Hello, my name's Laura. I work for Grant North East of Cumbria. We're here in Piercebridge in County Durham to do a talk on the history of Piercebridge. So we'll start with the obvious one. Piercebridge is built on top of a Roman fort. As you can see from the side. We're actually stood within the fort at the moment. It is the Roman fort of Morbium. Basically the buildings that you can see around us are built within the walls of the original fort, so it gives you a nice idea of roughly how big it was. The road you see behind us is originally the North Gate. That is the Porta Pretoria, because through that road came the North-South road, the original one, which was the Via Pretoria. The Via Pretoria came to a building called the Praetorium, which is kind of the commander's house. However, in this case it's slightly different. I can explain later, but at the moment it comes to a building called the Principia instead. So the Principia was the headquarters building, usually 2 stories high, like a courtyard building. So you had the main building, which contained the altar to whatever local god that they're actually supporting. Usually it was Mars. Mars was the god of war, which kind of makes sense for a soldier's fort. And in that same area would be the strong room, where all the soldiers' wages would be kept, as well as all the taxation that was collected from around here before it was brought into the actual fort and then taken back to Ibrahim, which is now York. So if you keep going through that gate and keep going north, the next fort you come to is Binchester. Binchester is now where Bishop Auckland is. Beyond there you have Ebchester and Lanchester as well, which are Roman forts, until you get up to Corbridge on Hadrian's Wall. Now you'll notice when I said, Binchester, Lanchester, Ebchester, they've got the word Chester in the end of the name. Chester in a name of a town, or Cester or Castor, it comes from the Roman word for fort, which was castrum. It's also the way we get the word castle from as well. So anywhere with Castor or Chester, so Manchester and Chester itself. Lancashire, it's come from Lancashire, the actual town Lancaster was a Roman fort. So it's a good way of figuring out what were Roman towns originally. So what we're going to do now is, the majority of the area hasn't been excavated. The only place that's been excavated is the East Gate, which is this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk down and have a look at the excavated East Gate. Right, so this is the excavated section of the Fort of Morbium, excavated in the 1970s. Where I'm stood at the moment is directly in the middle of the East Gate, which is the Porta Principalis Dextra of the main fort. So the road that ran through here was the Via Principalis, which ran as well to the Principia building in the middle. So this would have been 2 arches originally. So centre point here, 2 great arches, wide enough that you could get basically a car through either side, a cart, horse and cart either side. Above that was another further 2 stories of building on top of it, with a rampart on the top of it. Wall running in each direction, 25 to 30 feet tall, enough room on the top to walk along the top of it. Each corner of the fort is playing card shape, so each corner would have had a tower on it as well. So you've got armoured gates, armoured corners to the fort as well, and then a wall you can walk all the way around with ramparts on the top to stop things coming in. On the outside, if you come this way, you can see 2 great ditches. Now originally these ditches, as you came towards the fort, would have a gently sloping side, and then the face facing you from the fort would have been almost a vertical side, and in the bottom there was a U-shaped cut, and it's called an ankle breaker. The idea is that you slip and slide on the slide down, and as you stop you snap your ankle, so you don't actually go up, and also all your mates charging in after you and nobody can get up and everybody piles up, at which point the guys on top of this wall are lobbing stuff at you, usually pointy stuff. So there's two sets of them, and then between the inner ditch and the wall were actually holes about 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, and in the bottom of them there would have been sharpened sticks, and over the top would have been brush, so you wouldn't have been able to see them. So then once you've got through 2 layers of ditches, you would have found just random holes that you were falling in, standing on spikes going through the bottoms of your feet, because obviously they didn't have solid shoes like we do. There's even a theory that between the 2 ditches, or at this side of the ditch, there was a hawthorn and blackthorn hedge that you would have had to fight your way through as well. That's before you even get to the 25 foot tall, straight up vertical walls with blokes throwing things at you. So as you can see, they were fairly safe and secure inside a Roman fort. So the road that we're stood on now, because Roman forts are fairly generalised, this is the Via Sagularius. I do apologise for my Latin pronunciation. So on this side there was the wall, and on this side was the commander's house. Now usually the commander's house, or the praetorium, is to the west of the Principia, but for some reason it's actually here, and it's slightly off centre from the actual fort. So there is a theory that this predates the fort that we're stood in. Now the fort that we're stood in is from about 260, 270 AD, but the bridge that they put in and the civilian settlement are from between 70 and 100 AD. There's 150 years difference between those two, and there must have been a fort here, because you wouldn't leave a crossing of a river undefended, particularly as up here was fairly dangerous, I think is the best description. Kind of backwoods up here. So it's entirely possible that what we're stood on top of are 2 forts. You've got the fort from 260 AD, and below it is an earlier fort from 80-90 AD that 130 years later they basically revamped. The way they think of that is, not only is this building slightly kinked off, is that this is a drain. Down the bottom of the drain the stones are perfectly cut. Now you wouldn't cut perfect stones to go in a drain that's going to get covered over with slabs, because originally this would have been slabbed from side to side. So a couple of different reasons why they think that. But the commander's house, what you can see here is one wing. So originally it was 4 great wings around a central courtyard. What we've got here is the east wing. It runs from the main road east-west all the way pretty much to the edge of the fort. If you imagine a 4-winged house, normally the east, west and south ranges were short 1-storey affairs, and the north range was a 2-storey building. So if you can imagine a 2-storey building running that way, and this is just a single storey all the way down. Now in this side of the building, this is the only bit of it that's actually being excavated. Down this bottom section here, in the ground is actually a Y-shaped cut. That Y-shaped cut is a hypercourse system. It's an underground heating system. So originally that would have been connected to a big fire in one of the other buildings, possibly this direction, and it would have funneled hot smoke and air underneath the floor, probably a York paving sandstone floor that would have heated up from underneath. In really posh buildings it went then up into flues in the wall and out the top of the wall, so you had heated walls and a heated floor, which this far north, for people who usually came from more warmer climes of Spain, southern France, Italy, even North Africa, it would have been quite advantageous to them, particularly at this time of year. So that's the commander's house. On the other side of the road there are other buildings which I'll take you over to and show you now. So the building you can see behind me, you can only see one little corner of. This is more likely than not a granary. Now inside a Roman fort, in general you have the same sorts of buildings. Occasionally they moved around, like the Principia and the the Principia and the Pretoria. But in general what you have inside is you have a Principia, which is a headquarters building. You have a Praetorium, which is where the commander lived, which is the building behind you. You have granaries, which stored not only grain but all your foodstuffs, because obviously if you're being attacked, you want to make sure that your food is inside your fort, otherwise you're going to starve to death. You're going to have barrack blocks, because you've got between 3,500 and 4,000 troops in here at any one time, depending on whether or not they're out and about collecting taxes or going up to Hadrian's Wall to assist up there. You're also going to have things like workshops. You're going to have things like metalsmiths. You're going to have a baker probably inside the fort, more than likely with his ovens into the outside wall, because the outside wall was the only building in here that was 100% stone. You don't want to stick it inside a wooden building and set it on fire and accidentally burn your fort down. The other thing that you're going to have in here is you're going to have stables, because based at Morbium, according to a treaty that was found in Rome from the late 4th, early 5th century, there was a group of cavalry based here. I have their name written down, one second, because it is in Latin and I don't do Latin usually. Prefectus Aquitatum Cataphractorum. Hence why I needed to make sure it was written now. Basically they are heavy cavalry, and more than likely they were based at the north side of the fort, because there's many more drains of the fort at that side. Also the toilet block is up on that side as well, and obviously any waste you want to kind of get out the fort and away as quickly as possible. So yes, there's an awful lot of things in the actual fort that we know should be here, but because it hasn't been excavated, they're not exactly certain where everything is. So what we've got here is Toft's Field. Now Toft's Field in itself doesn't look particularly interesting. It's a big grassy field. But what is underneath that field is a thing called a vicus. Now a vicus is the civilian settlement on the outside of the fort, and the word vicus is where we get the word village from. So if we pan down onto the picture, this gives you an idea of what it would have looked like. We're stood about here. What you've got is the main street running away into the distance. The second Roman bridge is over here, with Deer Street running along here. The original one would have been here, and this is the original Deer Street, but it got washed away and they moved it. So this is the main road. On this main road you can see there are bars and restaurants. There is a baker's. There is a butcher's. This is a private house with a party going on in the background. There are people making bricks. There are people farming. Basically anything you can imagine that you would need in a village supporting a fort. So there would be leather makers, metal workers, people making cloth, people making clothing, people making shoes, people putting hobnails back into the shoes if they'd lost them. Anything you can think of that you would need would be here. And it's all underneath that grass. The reason you can't see it is a lot of them were wooden framed buildings with wattle door, which is hazel with mud on the outside of it. A couple of 100 years of no maintenance, you've got a small pile of earth, maybe some tiles on the surface. But the civilian settlement here dates from between 70 and 100 AD. The fort's from 260 AD, so the civilian settlement was here before that fort was built. So whether or not there's another fort underneath it, we don't know, but there's an age difference there. The other thing as well, with the Roman road being moved, Deer Street originally was a lot closer to us, with a first bridge that went in about 70 AD, that got washed away, and then the second bridge was put in, and they had to put that further downstream. So the actual road moved, so it's an elongated settlement instead of being quite close to it. The other thing as well is on the other side, through the west gate, there's a possibility that there is a vicus on that side as well, because obviously people would follow the river downstream, and that would have been the gate that they came in from. There was geophysics done in 2009 when Time Team was here digging, and that showed potential vicus civilian settlement on that side as well. So here you can see a map of the fort overlaid a map of the modern settlement. So this is the Principia building, this is the Praetorian building, granaries. These are more than likely going to be stables, barrack blocks, workshops. The little square in the corner is an area that has been excavated but isn't open to the public, and that's the latrines. Now the latrines in a fort were communal, so you didn't have individual cubicles when you went to the toilet. You could basically sit on a stone slab which had like a keyhole shape cut into it, and your mate would sit down next to you and you'd have a bit of a natter while you were doing your morning ablutions. Now the other thing is that they didn't have toilet paper. The way that they wiped was to use a sponge on a stick, and as well as the seating being communal, the sticks and sponges were communal as well. So you would wash them off in usually a trough of water that was running in front of you after you'd used it, and then put it in a bucket of vinegar at the end to sterilise it. We think that's where to get hold of the wrong end of the stick comes from, because obviously if you get hold of the wrong end of one of those sticks, you're getting the sponge end, and that wouldn't be nice at all. So that would have drained out and down into the River Tees, probably on a completely separate drainage system to the rest of the fort and the rest of the settlement as well. So yeah, that's the latrines. Unfortunately you can't get to them because they are actually in a farmer's yard. Basically you have to look at it from the thing. But if you have a look at the map again, you can see that this is the original Deer Street. So this is the crossing from 70 AD. Civilian settlement is between 70 and 100 AD. This fort here is from 260 AD. So there's a good 100 years between these two, 150 years nearly. If you look at this building here, the commander's house, it's actually not square to the fort. It's slightly kinked that way, so that here it's closer to the wall than it is here. Romans didn't build stuff wonky. They always built in straight lines as much as they possibly could. Their roads are straight, their buildings are straight, their forts are straight. That's wonky. Now one possibility is that the original fort was slightly kinked off and was made out of wood. Now if it was made out of wood, they might have built the commander's house in stone, make it nice for him, put some underfloor heating in for him, and have the rest of the fort around them in wood. 140, 150 years later, it's probably not looking its best. They'll have probably done quite a few repairs to it, and they thought, you know what, demolish it, we'll start again. And what they've done is they've demolished the rest of the wooden fort, rebuilt it in stone, slightly moved the angle of it, and left the commander's house as is. So it's entirely possible that commander's house is the only building surviving from the original fort, and the rest of the fort got rebuilt it in stone around him. So the other thing you have to remember when you come to Piercebridge is all the buildings inside Piercebridge are only 1600s, 1500s, something like that. So you're talking 1,000 years after the Romans left. Now when the Romans left, more than likely people kept on living here because it was a defendable area with the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes coming in. They would have kept up maintenance of the buildings, but eventually buildings fall down, and what you'll find is majority of the modern 500-year-old buildings are built of two different sorts of stone. So over here you can see that there are rounded stones. There's a rounded stone, that's a rounded stone. These come from the river, which is just behind us. It would make sense to move these sorts of stones in here to use. However, you've got things like that, which is a Roman flagstone, so that's a flooring stone. Underneath it you've got Roman brick or Roman tile. If you look, a lot of these stones are roughly the same size. Now these ones here, when the Roman legionaries were building the fort, they tended to cut them to two different sizes. They tended to cut them to that sort of size, because that's an easily handleable stone. You can easily move that between men, you can fill up wheelbarrows and move them. that it's a nice, easy, small stone to use. Then you would have bigger stones, things like this one here, which runs all the way through, is slightly longer, slightly wider, slightly thicker. So that would have been for surroundings of doors, surroundings of windows, corners of buildings. So you would put them in, and then you would fill in with these around them. If you go to Hadrian's Wall, they're all about that size. When the buildings fell down, the people around here, instead of going to the local quarry, why would you go to a quarry? There's a big pile of pre-cut stone there. All you have to do is clean the mortar off it. So they basically robbed the buildings and rebuilt walls. This is a farm wall, dividing Toft's Field, which is a farmer's field, from the archaeological site that was being excavated. But it's full of Roman wall material, roofing material, flooring material that's been just reused. A lot of the buildings around here, when you look at them, they're all made out of probably about 70% Roman material, and then a few rounded boulders that they've pulled out of the river. In general, in this country, we recycle as much as possible, and even back then you would recycle, but it wasn't for environmental reasons, it was for money saving reasons. It was cheaper to go rip it out of a hole in the ground where it was pre-cut than it was to pay somebody to dig it out of a quarry and bring it to you. People up north aren't daft. Where there's muck there's brass and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, a lot of the walls around here, if you look, are either rounded stones from the river, Roman stuff, Roman. Just have a look at the walls. So we're now stood in roughly the middle of the bridge at Piercebridge. So on the right hand side is the settlement of Cliff, which includes the George Coaching Inn, which is in North Yorkshire, and on the left hand side is the north side of the river, and that is County Durham. So we are on the boundary between County Durham and North Yorkshire. The other thing we can see here, just wait for the lorries to go past, there we go, is the location of the two Roman bridges. So the first Roman bridge was built in about 70 AD, roughly where the steps of the George come down. You see the steps, far side of the George, there's a bunch of steps coming down with pots, and there's an orange ring. Roughly there is where the first bridge crossed. So if you come back to the river, we can see that it would have crossed across. Now, one thing to be aware of is that the river has moved since Roman times. It is far further north than it used to be, so it has eroded the left hand side bank and built out on the right hand side. So originally it would have been much further over. More than likely the George would have been in the river rather than above ground. You can see that there's an island as well. There is a theory that there was an island as well, potentially an island that instead of it being a single span bridge, it would have been to the island away. That's because there's been a bunch of divers going to this river and find Roman artifacts from the bottom, and they think that it was a votive offering place, basically somewhere where you would make an offering to make sure that your journey was better, and you would have buried it on the island and then carried on your way. Now the second Roman bridge was put in further downstream, probably because on the right hand side there's quite a big cliff, so the river is quite narrow, and when it's in flood it becomes very fast flowing. Further downstream, where you can see the river starting to break up, there's like a riffle. It widens out an awful lot there, and because it widens out, when it floods the flow is less, which is probably why they moved it down there. So the one below us would have been 100% wood, and the one further down has stone abutments at the bottom and then a wooden section on the top. There's also been found posts in here that they've done dendrochronology, where they count the tree rings and then link it into tree rings from known historical dates. They are BC rather than AD in date. They don't know whether or not it's an Iron Age bridge, or it could be an Iron Age wharf for a ferry to go across. They're not entirely certain because they found it at the edges rather than in the middle of the river. So potentially there was an Iron Age bridge that was then replaced by a Roman bridge that was then replaced by another Roman bridge, which was then replaced by the bridge that we stood on now. So we've had a look at the Roman fort at Piercebridge. This is the Roman bridge at Piercebridge. It is one of only two in the country, the other one being up at Corbridge Fort, well, near Corbridge Fort. So the original bridge was, well, they're not entirely certain, over 100 metres long, definitely. So the first bridge was made entirely out of wood. That got washed away. This one was put in the early 200s-ish, probably slightly before the Roman fort was put in. So you can see that it's big stone blocks on stone flags. Stone flags were put in first. This is to stop erosion of the river around the actual abutments, and then the abutments were put in on top. River flowing that way, so going from that way. So more pointed on this side than on that side, because obviously you want to break the water. This is the south abutment, so this was the southern edge of the river. The river was that way. So on top of here was probably another layer of stones, and then over the top of that was the wooden bridge on top of it. So you would have had 3 layers of stonework, and then a wooden arch, and then a wooden deck on top of it. During the time that the Romans were here, the 200 odd years since this was built, the river slowly moved that way, to the point where this became dry land. And instead of repairing the wooden bridge over the top, they just filled it in with rubble and gravel and turned it into a causeway, and only repaired the wood on the actual bridge bit. This was discovered in 1972. They were actually digging out gravel. It was a gravel quarry when they clipped this, and they managed to expose it. It's now a heritage site, but we can go down and have a look at the rest of it. The rest of it's pretty rubbly. So you pan round, you can see down the bottom it's fairly rubbly down the bottom there. The piers have collapsed more. More than likely that happened in 1 or 2 big floods. Before Cow Green Reservoir was put in on the Tees in the 60s, the Tees was renowned for massive floods. It's entirely possible that this bridge was still being used in the 1500s. They were just repairing the wooden bits, and then a big flood came through and took it down, and that's why they built the first bit of the existing bridge that's there. In fact, in November of 1771, that was known as the Great Flood. It had been snowing for about a month heavily, what we would call the beast in the east, so lots of snow up in the hills, and the wind swung round and they got torrential rain for a week. The Tyne, the Tees and the Weir all flooded. They lost every single bridge on the Tyne bar one. The Elvet Bridge in Durham lost 3 of its arches, and it's said that on the Tees at Barnard Castle, you could stand on Barnard Castle Bridge, lean over and touch the water, to give you an idea how deep it was. The river here, they think, was between half a mile wide and 3/4 of a mile wide. Yarm flooded, 12 to 15 feet deep in water at the High Street. That gives you an idea of how much water used to come down the Tees before Cow Green was put in, and you can see why it's entirely possible that this bridge got taken out in a massive flood in the 1500s. So yes, the Roman bridge, not much to see, but it's quite good material. This is the more modern bridge in Piercebridge, the one that everybody drives across, so I apologise for the sound of traffic in the background. It is in fact two different bridges. The bridge on the east side, the one that we're stood on here, is 15th century. It was then widened in the 16th century making that side wider. The way that you can tell is on this side there are 3 courses of bricks. 1, 2, 3. That side there's only 2. Then they're much better cut on that side as well. So it was widened in the 16th century. The other thing that happened here happened in December of 1642, and that is the Battle of Piercebridge. Now the Battle of Piercebridge was a battle during the Civil War, and it was between royalists and parliamentarians. What it was there was the Earl of Newcastle was coming south from Newcastle trying to get to York. There was a royalist based in York, and they were being surrounded by the parliamentarians. So the royalists are coming south, they need to get across this bridge. The parliamentarians realise that they have to stop them. Now the royalists outnumbered the parliamentarians 10 to 1. What the parliamentarians did was they barricaded this bridge, so you can imagine barrels and rubble and wicker gabions, so you make like a basket and you fill it with earth across the middle of this bridge. And then behind us, underneath those trees, is a hill with quite a steep slope. They had 2 cannon. They stuck the 2 cannon on the top of that hill, aiming at the entrance into this bridge. Quite a few of these buildings would have been here at that date. It's entirely possible that the parliamentarians had men hidden in the buildings trying to pick royalists off. So the royalists attack, they realise that they've got cannon, the royalists have cannon as well, and behind us is Calvary Hill, and they stick 10 cannon on the top of Calvary Hill and start bombarding that cannon position. Just wait for this truck to go past. So the battle continues. The parliamentarians lose an awful lot of men. Eventually the royalists break through this barrier and carry on going. Quite often these houses down here, when they're digging in the garden, find the lead shot in their gardens. So they're still finding bits of history. Once the royalists got across, they got down to York and beat the parliamentarians at the Battle of Tadcaster. Didn't help them. 4 years later they got beaten at Marsden Moor, and that was it. Civil War over, parliamentarians won.